Hello, business innovators and educators. You're listening to The Enterprise Learning Architect. I'm your host, Chris Knotts, here to guide you through practices and ideas you can use to help build a culture of learning in your organization. Stay tuned to power up your professional playbook as we have conversations with exceptional people who share their experience in achieving successful learning outcomes. Ready to innovate, educate, and iterate? Let's do it. Welcome to this episode of the ELA Podcast, where today we're pushing the boundaries of digital learning with a discussion of AR, XR, and VR technologies as a learning and training modality. We're joined by Rich Levy. Rich is a senior software architect and a longtime leader in training software engineering teams. His expertise is grounded in Java and iOS development, but Rich and I have done work together using augmented and virtual reality as a technical education tool. XR platforms promise to make learning experiences more immersive and effective than ever before. Rich's knack for leading high-performing technical teams make him the perfect guide through this rapidly emerging new world. Buckle up as we explore the future of training and development with Rich and discover how cutting-edge technology will enhance learning experiences across industries. All right. Hey, Rich, thanks for joining the conversation today on the pod.
You're welcome, Chris. Good to see you.
It's always good to see you. So we'll jump right in here to today's conversation. We are here to talk about next generation technologies in learning and training, specifically things like AR, VR, extended reality, stuff like that. And I know this is a particular area of interest for you. So I thought it might be nice to have a chat when we can kind of explore these things a little bit. And you and I have done a little bit of work in this area, tinkered around a little bit and so forth. You and I both also, we should note, come from a long background in delivering training, delivering classes and things like that. So as people will have heard from the intro, you're excellent software engineer, and you work with a lot of software teams and do a lot of technical agility training and engineering training and things like that. But also being a software engineer and a developer yourself, you're pretty tech forward, I think it's safe to say. And so part of that starts getting into your interest in some of these extended reality modalities. So I guess we'll talk about the training thing here in a minute, but first I just wanted to kind of get your overall take on the state of XR, VR, AR, the metaverse, all that stuff as it stands today. It's been a little bit since we spoke about this, so I'm just kind of curious on your perspective on all that stuff these days.
Yeah, so I'm a child of the 80s, and the idea of virtual reality, it really sort of ticks a box for me. It's the future, isn't it? It's what the future looked like in the 80s, and I'm old enough to have experienced the first round of virtual reality where you essentially had a cathode ray tube monitor and a tower PC on the side of your head, and you were lucky if you lasted 5 minutes. But it was an incredible experience. And recently, the last 10 years, this sort of technology has come on leaps and bounds, like most technology. But for some reason, it's still remained niche. But last year, with Apple obviously throwing themselves into the ring, I think it's really brought this technology forward, and it's fantastic for competition. Even though Apple are maybe not going the traditional virtual reality type route with a spatial computer, the hardware itself is really being driven on. Obviously the Apple gear is a very high price point, but companies like Meta and also a lot of Chinese companies are out there. They're putting out headsets on a regular basis, and they're advancing the hardware. And in fact, if anything, it's the software that's lagging on it.
Yeah, and so you've had a chance to play with this stuff a little bit, I know that we messed with some Oculus gear a while ago, but you've had some time to digest this, obviously. And we were interested primarily in kind of applying this to our training, spreading the VR onto our training products.
Yeah, definitely.
Now that you've had some time to kind of think about it and digest it, there's a little bit of distance between us and that project. What do you think about the potential? Are you still convinced that AR, VR, XR stuff presents new opportunities for delivering learning solutions?
Absolutely, 100% convinced on that. And actually what I find frustrating is that the platforms out there that are accessible and pretty cheap. Something like the Meta headset is going to set you back $300, $400, which for a company is not a very high barrier to entry. The software platform itself has not really moved forward in the way certainly I know you and I had hoped. Obviously, COVID was there. We were used to very much training in the classroom, which is great. You can look people in the eye, you can really engage with them, and importantly, they engage back. And now COVID's happened, and we're in a world of remote training. And for those of us that have been on the delivery end of that, sometimes it can feel a little bit like doing a podcast because you are faced with 15 blank windows and microphones off and cameras off. And it means that the quality of that training, as a trainer, you're not sure how much quality you're delivering because you're not getting any feedback. And training is a two-way conversation. We train people, we engage with those people, but we need them to engage back and engage with each other. So remote-based training, despite being incredibly convenient, does lose something for that convenience as well. Everything's a trade-off. So the idea of being able to put a headset on and go to a virtual location and to be able to bring a lot of that in-person experience back, for me, was extremely exciting. And as well with the remote team, it's got a lot of potential for doing that. Lots of development teams, or even outside of that scope, you don't really have to be doing development or anything like that. Any remote team can really benefit from getting together. And the virtual environment can act as a great trade-off of time and costs versus the ability to actually get together in the same room. So yeah, it's been really good. I think it's got a huge amount of potential, absolutely huge, but nobody has really quite hit the nail on the head in terms of the features of the platform to deliver. Everybody will look, I think, primarily to Meta. They've got the most mature platform out there in their Horizons workspace and workrooms. And don't get me wrong, it is great. But from a training perspective, I find it's just missing a couple of key features. And I really thought that certainly when you and I started looking at this coming up to 2 years ago now, I really thought that the platform would move on really quickly, but it seems to be pivoting in a bit of a different direction to where we were hoping it was going to go. So it's not quite there yet. I think you could make something work, but it wouldn't be optimal at the moment. Meta, of course, have just announced that they're opening up their platform though. So I think it's going to be really interesting when that's going to go. And obviously, Apple have got an incredible piece of hardware. There's no reason that people couldn't develop like a virtual classroom for that sort of hardware. And the rumors are that they've stopped development on the second generation of that headset and are now focusing on a more cheaper version of that. So hopefully bringing that to a wider market.
Yeah, exactly. And so the platform components we see are kind of there. But as somebody who specializes in learning services, training delivery, that's where we haven't seen things catch up quite yet, right? Like we need the we need the we need the vertical focus of training and learning delivery to kind of be spread over top of this platform. So, the gaming world and things like that are maybe like a step or two ahead, but we're in an even more specialized type of area that we're trying to do. And so, like thinking about pedagogy, skills transfer, demos, facilitating workshops, doing labs, and things like that. Those are kind of like very specific applications, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to be able to spin up a classroom where I had a whiteboard that I could draw on really easily, which is something that Meta have just taken out of their Workrooms platform, which is a little bit surprising. I'd love to, I can share my screen, that's great, but I can't share my audio, which is a little odd. And also I can't have, as a trainer, you know that you have a nice clean slide deck presented to delegates that you have in the classroom. You've probably got some notes as well. Well, you need to look at something else. So the ability to show one thing to the people in the room, but for me personally to see another thing on like a virtual screen in front of me. These sorts of things and it's not a huge list of things that need to happen to make this a real viable platform. They're just missing at the moment, which is very frustrating for me, because we were very nearly there. Certainly with my team, we were able to hold uh, regular meetings. We'd do a daily stand up. We'd have a demo at the end of a sprint where I could share my screen, my single screen, with everybody on a large view within the room, and everyone could see it, and it was great for that. But beyond that, sadly, those features, they're not there yet. But it would be great to have a training platform that was built on top of what was there, that would just really make it easy for people to deliver training and also receive training at the same time as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's a marketplace product opportunity we're discussing here that somebody needs to come along and tap
Absolutely.
into.
I think what we've discovered from our investigation into it, though, is there's two levels of creating software within a virtual reality platform. One would be with a tool that the actual platform itself provides to you. So Meta do Horizon Worlds, which is very, very clever, and has got a scripting framework built into it, so you can drag and drop and build quite a complex application within there. We created the batch penny game for our potential future agile training, and that works really well. But if you want to create anything more custom, more involved, then yeah, you're going to have to step into actual development to do it. And if you're a software engineer and you're looking to develop for something like the Meta platform or for the Apple headset, it really is a step in towards gaming territory, because you have to understand graphics, you have to understand how the models work, how you visually representing in 3D. As much as they'll give you these lovely frameworks to work with, you still need that base understanding. So there is a barrier to entry, even for, I think, seasoned software developers.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a few pieces there that, I'd like to zero in on a little bit. The first point that you made was sort of the perspective of just a software product, where now we've got a few additional layers to that, right? Like there's a three-dimensional modeling layer, a graphics layer, things like that, maybe even like a streaming layer that you might not have to deal with unless you're sort of involved in a specialized, video product or something like that. But this is interesting to me because it strikes me that if we were going to imagine productizing kind of an at scale line of training experiences or something like that, there would be a lot of that would just be handled in terms of like the way we would handle typical software product line. There's some specialized components to it, but in terms of running a commercial product line for something like that, a lot of the types of things that you and I have a lot of experience dealing with, managing product software teams and just kind of the way that you would manage an agile release cadence and building features and things like that. A lot of that would probably apply, right? Like if you take that on the one hand, and then you take kind of some of the platform architecture that we've been talking about on the other, you still lack maybe a few key ingredients. One of them being the instructional component, like just the experience of being a trainer, building good learning experiences, and that is sort of its own specialty, I think. But
Yep,
but
absolutely.
uh, but if you got the ingredients there, then I guess my point, the first point at least about this, is that just running a good, streamlined, agile software production line would be probably like a pretty good baseline to involve in something like this. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, there's lots of platforms out there already that will enable you to deliver training. And if we considered a typical training course in the real world, where you're standing in a room, we're all in the same room, we're all sitting around tables, I've got a whiteboard and a pen and a flip chart and a lot of knowledge in my head, to replicate that in virtual reality in in a platform that was designed to do that, in a product that was designed to do that, yeah, I think you could just drop in the content. You've got your PowerPoint deck or a PDF or whatever that needs to be. Your delegates have got the material that they need. You could just push that into the platform. The platform would then serve it. They get to see it on a virtual tablet in front of them, and we could replicate that live experience. And I don't think that that's a million miles away, even from the free platforms that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
And with all the tooling and then the SDKs that are available, I was going to say that would be easy, but there would be a mistake for me to say that. I would say that it could easily do that. Easily do that. I think what's really interesting about virtual reality is not just to use it to replace or replicate what we can do in our own physical environment. We are outside of the constraints of a lot of the physics of a real environment in virtual reality. What could we do in there? And that's what's really interesting. How could we differentiate from a classroom experience to not simply replicating that in the virtual world, but what could the virtual world bring to training? And I don't think many people have really explored that. And you try and ideate this sort of thing, and you can only go so far, I think, without actually trying it.
Mm-hmm.
But building a platform that would give you that freedom to try things that people have yet to even conceptualize, that's really interesting. And I think there's a real opportunity there, because everybody around the world will at some point attend a training course. And if they don't have to travel to do it, or if as we've all seen, you would host a training course and there's not enough people around at this time to attend, well, you can throw that net to a very wide audience that are either simply in your time zone or close enough, or are willing to attend your training course in the middle of the night. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. So this gets into some very interesting territory indeed, because now we're starting to think about some of the things that are involved in kind of effective learning services. And you mentioned a couple of these things right off the cuff, which is that we hear feedback in the training world from customers already that travel is a burden. It works both ways, right? Like they don't necessarily want to send their employees, even if it's just across town, for a local seated training program. They've gotten used to Zoom, they've gotten used to distributed workplaces and things like that. And but there's still value, as we've seen, to being co-located in a physical classroom, and that's there's a certain aspect of having a subject matter expert in the room and talking through specific issues, and just having that face time that it's everybody acknowledges that it's valuable, but the convenience of not having to drive across town still kind of is putting pressure against that. But so there's logistical objections from customers, right? And then on the flip side, they may not want to pay for the travel of the instructor, to come in and visit their site. There's scheduling burdens there as well. We hear a lot of feedback about this, a 1 day, 2 day, 3 day training program. It's just a lot of time out of work. And so they want solutions that are more flexible. And I think even just setting aside the question of XR or VR for a moment, the training marketplace is still trying to figure out how can we get the right combination of flexible modalities there, because there's trade-offs, right? So like one option is just on-demand learning, and that certainly has its place. It can be quite good for fundamental level content, baselining, and things like that, almost like prerequisite stuff. There's some good combination there, because learners can consume that stuff and not have to spend the first 2 hours of their valuable classroom time kind of covering that. It can kind of be almost like a requirement before you come in. So there's some flexibility there. But even then, with the on-demand content, you don't then have the support, right? Like there's nobody on the other end of the line. So if obviously most of the domain areas we're dealing with are quite technical. They're very specialized. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of context involved. So just whatever comes out of the can on demand, it might get you one step down the road, but it's not going to be very long before learners have questions. They want to understand how to apply what they're learning and things like that. So there's a disconnect, isn't there, between the sort of what's available as a good learning experience from an on-demand or like an e-learning or what have you type perspective versus having a real live expert there. And then bringing it back to the XR, this is where I start to see there's probably some potential just to meet these business requirements of the customer, right? Like they need logistical ease, they need frictionless delivery, but they also need flexibility. How do they get that flexibility without only relying on demand content where there's no support? There's no ability to talk to a coach in a live environment or something like that, but they still, they can get the best of both worlds here. And so you see where I'm going with this, right? Like it seems to me like there's some, it's better than Zoom. It bridges a gap between on demand. You can even serve on demand content over VR in a way that would probably be way richer, right? Like way more meaningful in terms of a learning experience. But you can also do live over VR. So there could be a bit of a missing link here, maybe.
There is definitely, I think there's a sliding scale, isn't there, of training. I think what we need to understand when we're thinking about training, like you said, take the technology out of it. What's the real value in having an in-person training course? And that is the two-way conversation. I'm pretty sure that everyone who's attended a certified training course that may well have an official deck that goes with it, a lot of times it's very much wrapped up in a bow. It all seems very straightforward when you're in the classroom and you're given an exercise in a nice, neat context, and it's relatively straightforward for you to work out what you need to do to move through this particular learning, certainly from a technical perspective. And then you get back to your desk on the Monday morning afterwards, and here you are as a developer working with a million lines of legacy Java code when nobody had ever considered design on it when it was first created 15 years ago. How do I apply what I've just learned to what I'm actually working with on a day-to-day basis? And having an instructor in the room to ask that question, how do I even start with this? Because here I am writing a unit test for a class which is 10 lines long, yeah? My class is like 10,000 lines long. How do I get from where I am today to where I've got to work with? And obviously, as a trainer, you're not going to solve that question because, of course, context is king in every piece of training and every organization. But you can start to have the conversations and you can start to point them in the right direction. So there's like a value add, a real value add to having a trainer to actually engage with. And you can do that in VR. If I was to host a VR course, I would do things like in the break, I would have like a coffee area and I would go there in VR and I would try and replicate those chats that you get into over lunch, over break, your water cooler moments where somebody who, again, maybe is not brave enough to put their hand up in front of everyone would just say, Rich, how do I do this? How would I work with this bit of situation that I find myself in? And there's real value in that. So virtual reality training coming into this virtual environment, yes, it's a trade-off, but it tips you over the edge, I think, into the real value add of having a two-way conversation, two-way engagement in a training engagement, which you're not going to get from e-learning, which, don't get me wrong, does have its place. But I think it's as an introductory, like you said, prereq, baseline people before a bit of learning, or maybe a very small bit of bite-sized training that you want to do. It's great for that. But yeah, the real value in training comes from the collaboration with the other people on the training course, and also asking those questions. How do I apply what you're teaching me to what I have to work with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it's a great call out. And so, another thing that I wanted to ask you about is we're discussing and we're kind of alluding and dancing around this a little bit, but it strikes me that there's maybe three or four, maybe more, but I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking about the actual experience, the augmented reality or the VR experience here. And there's a few different dimensions here that we could think about. So the first one is the one we've spoken mostly about, which is just replicate what it means to get everybody together. You're almost you're not really innovating on the fundamental training modality at all. You're just, except that you're giving people a forum, kind of getting them in a room, as you will, or whatever, so that you can do all the things that you can only do when you're in a room. But beyond that, nothing's really different. So even that is a kind of an innovation that the VR opens up to us. But let's say it's just whiteboard, flip chart, somebody with a lot of knowledge in their head, and you want to get everybody together so they can talk, they can engage, and things like that. So that kind of basic classroom experience the AR unlocks. So that's kind of thing one. Thing two is taking that a step further, and I remember you and I had some very interesting conversations about this, and you pointed me towards some really interesting research, which is that going a step further to that, there's this idea of, well, a lot of things that we're going to be training on basically comes down to people doing things on computers, right? So their experience on the job is going to be, in an IDE, or doing some type of professional work. They're looking at a screen. So, how do we think about the difference between just looking at work on a screen and understanding how to apply some kind of skills where you're using a computer to do something? And I can remember, I can't remember exactly what the source was, but you pointed me to this really cool research reference where they were saying, well, the AR VR has a lot to offer there as well, because once you're in this like virtual environment, you can create these fantastical environments that just wouldn't be able to be accessed in real space. And I'm thinking specifically about this this situation in which it was like in VR, you could still be looking at your screen, but the screen's like 30 feet high or something like that. And I think you actually tested this out a little bit to make sure it was still readable and things like that. But just in terms of thinking about screen real estate, even if you have a command center, big monitor workspace, and you've got whatever 36-inch flat screen TVs, and maybe you've got 3 of those or something, just to maximize your screen real estate, that's a drop in the bucket compared to what you could actually set up in a virtual space. And now all of a sudden, just the interface between you and the computer you're working on is a completely different deal, right? And so there's potentially value in that. So that's the second one. So I'll stop there and let you talk about that for a second. Then I've got a third one that I want to talk about.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing that that it opens up to us, because what you've got in the headsets is it's just projecting pixels in front of you, and you can put whatever you want on those pixels. And really, the only thing that you're limited by in terms of usability there is the resolution of the hardware itself, and that's just going up all the time. Obviously, the Apple headset has got a 4K per eye. But there's even headsets coming out now which are going to go beyond that. Once you get to a certain point, then you can really put anything you like up there. So most people are limited by the physical space around them. So, for instance, I'm lucky enough to have a reasonable amount of space, and I have a very large 4K monitor in front of me. But as any good developer will know, I can always use one more monitor. I would always find a reason to have that. So you can pop on the headset and you can open a platform like Immersed, which has been around for quite some time, which creates a virtual environment for you to work in. And you can say, well, I'll have 5 4K monitors and I'll place them wherever I want. And yeah, I do want them to be 100-inch, each one to be 100-inch. And you can work in a very tiny space with this huge amount of virtual real estate in front of you. And what's really interesting about the company that created Immersed is that they are releasing a headset called Visor, which is explicitly for that purpose. It is essentially a monitor replacement. So you won't have to have any monitors at all. You'll just have a computer, and then you pop on the headset and you can have 5 4K monitors right in front of you. And you can have that in, if you've got where you live is pretty small, then all of a sudden you've got, you can be a lot more productive. But you can take that with you as well. So if you are working away, then you could take that and use it in a hotel. If you went to a coffee shop, you can put it on. And it's not some massive Meta-like headset. It actually looks like quite a cool pair of sunglasses. But yeah, that is there's a lot of potential there to create these environments.
Yeah. And so then getting to the third thing, which is sort of pushing the envelope even a little further, and this is probably where there's a lot of kind of futuristic speculation about what's possible. But in our work, we have in fact seen this becoming a real use case, and this is the idea of um, not just focusing on the having a virtual shared space, being able to bring distributed people together, but actually replicating spaces in virtual reality, which or maybe are difficult or dangerous to access or something like that, right? So if you think about high-tech simulations, technical environments in which you basically you're kind of learning on the job or whatever. There's things you have to do. I'm thinking about work. One use case that I encountered in a project with this was sort of like engineers who work on very high towers or something. They're doing electrical work at the top of radio broadcasting towers or cell phone towers, things like that. Or maybe it's like a bomb squad or something. Things like this where there's interaction with the physical environment beyond just looking at a monitor or something. But you have to actually manipulate things, learn how to do things. So it's becomes kind of this simulated thing, and that's a whole other situation. And I think that's one where you there's no shortage of articles and speculation and things about like this. There are not a lot of training products out there that fit that description. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. And in terms of like practicality, and then there's also there's always the pedagogical and the instructional design aspect to that. Creating an accurate replica in 3D space, using the Unity engine or like a gaming engine or some other 3D modeler. That's one thing, but then designing an engaging learning experience over top of that environment is another. And so, but it certainly seems like it could be done. It seems like it's just maybe waiting for the right intersection of talent between, software product management, XR expertise, and also instructional and training domain expertise to kind of come together to create those things. And then, of course, you've got like a domain expertise piece as well, because the very promise of these things is seems to be that in really specialized and often highly technical or dangerous environments, that's where there's really use there, because it's something that's hard to access, or you don't just get into a submarine and go down to an underwater drilling rig or something like that, but that, like, just being able to create a realistic enough situation in virtual space so that you're actually having a meaningful experience. There's a lot of really specific technical detail and things like that. So these are just some of the considerations that I've been thinking about, over the last year or so, maybe, in terms of the promise is there. It seems really hard, I guess. But what are your thoughts about that?
It does seem really hard at the moment, but if you look at the pace of the technology, and I think the amount of creativity and certainly the amount of competition coming in here, you can see that we're just limited by people's imagination. Okay, the hardware might not be here today, but it's going to get there. It's a fact. I can remember saying when we were talking about virtual reality initially, it's coming. Yeah, you can't stop it. It's coming. So let's get on board rather than just wait for it to arrive. So let's start working on it early. So I think what you're talking about there, like crafting new experiences, there are a lot of probably existing areas of work that would need to come together for that. So, for instance, you were talking about creating a realistic environment. It's no good simulating working at the bottom of the ocean on a deep sea oil rig if all you've got is something that looks like it was on a Wii in the early 2000s. It's not realistic, is it? So bringing in things like Unity, which is now a phenomenal platform, hyper realistic can be. We obviously need Unity developers and the creators from that platform to come together. But then to bring that together with the expertise from the area to craft a realistic experience and a realistic simulation. So the scenarios that would be put in place? What sort of actual training are we going to do? And then the hardware, of course, needs to come along as well. I think we've all played with virtual reality and realized that you might step over something, or you might go to swat something out of the way, but you don't feel it. So the sort of haptic feedback built into that, that would be a real game changer, I think. But I know there are companies out there that do experiences where they will map a virtual experience into a physical environment, so you can walk around and you can touch a wall because it's actually there and it's all synced up. But the sort of things that you're talking about, I think, are probably a bit more involved than that. But it is coming. We will be able to do it at some point, and it just takes the right person to come up with a solution. And then once you've come up with a way forward, other people will try to copy it, and that innovation that drives the whole hardware and software platform forward, and it will go to where it's needed the most. So the sort of simulation that you're talking about, there must be many dangerous industries, or there must be many difficult to replicate training experiences, or experiences that could benefit from training, that could use something like that. But I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leaps ahead at the moment, and we need to go along that path to actually get there. But it's coming.
Yeah, I agree completely. And, when I hear your description, it makes me feel like what you're basically describing is, again, just sort of setting aside the XR question for a moment. You're describing a kind of a tipping point with technology life cycles that we have seen over and over again. Right? We saw this with AI, most interestingly. Right now, this is not, you and I could probably have another conversation about AI, and maybe we will sometime. But if I think about it, one thing, I do this class that's on kind of AI for project managers. A lot of these folks have never really used the generative AI tools very much, and they're amazed when they see how much repetitive, mind-numbingly boring work that the AI can help them with. But we have a section in that workshop in which we kind of look at one of the Gartner hype cycles, and we're not just looking at the hype cycle for generative AI. We go back to like 2010 or so, to the big data craze. Remember the big data craze, the Hadoop tool set. And basically that was driven by like two fundamental tech paradigm shifts. One was the ability to do distributed parallel computing, enabled by the cloud, right? So you could leverage a 500, 1,000 powerful instances to do all this parallel processing. And then the second thing was just the availability of massive amounts of data. And when you kind of combine those two things, and then you got the clever wonks who understood how to build the data models and things like that, you could start to recognize these patterns in the data. And you had all of these really interesting use cases that opened up. But then if you think about the hype cycle, there was kind of then like this, what do they call it? Like the trough of disillusionment or whatever, because business leaders could see the promise of the use cases of big data, but actually implementing it in a practical way was still kind of clunky. And it was very hard, took real engineering wranglement to actually build solutions there. And so the value maybe didn't get realized, even though everybody could see the potential. But then with generative AI here, I think you're seeing is basically the maturation of that same cycle, because all of a sudden people have gotten the really hard bits engineered behind the scenes. So like the data models are all built, the transformer architecture totally changed the game, and how you could statistically detect relationships in language. So now we have these LLMs and things like that. That stuff all powers, and all of a sudden, like, there was a saying for years that in order to do AI, you had to kind of be this very special unicorn. What was it? I think they said you had to be a data scientist who was better at software development than your typical developer, and you had to be a developer who was better at data science than your typical statistician, or something to that effect, right? Very small little cross section of people, but all of a sudden, like, that's just gone. Like, that requirement is gone. Like, we all have access at a consumer level UX to these incredibly powerful AI models just via a chat interface or something like that. So you get what I'm saying, right? Like, there's a tipping point there. Like, for a decade, we saw lots of people working so hard in a very small research or comparatively small global research community to get these models and these AI algorithms and the machine learning technology to a point where we could all just use it in a way that was instantly accessible. And we see that type of cycle, right, with other types of technology. And that just to me is a little bit like what you're describing. When we get the hard bits figured out,
Yeah.
so you get where I'm going with that. But I just wonder if you agree or what.
Yeah, I think it's the case that initially this hardware was quite expensive, quite niche. It's obviously been very gaming oriented, but it's getting cheaper. But it does take that small group of people just to relentlessly drive it forward when everyone else has fallen away from the hype, because virtual reality is very much a victim of Hollywood. It's projected movies from the 90s like Lawnmower Man, and then we've got Ready Player One, and look at what VR could do for you, and then you put VR on at the time and like, well, that's not like that at all. But there is real passion within that community to continually drive that forwards. And I think, that's what needs to happen. And we're not there yet. We're not there. I can see that we are approaching, but I think that aside from the hardware and the general platforms that are out there like Meta, I think people are not yet. It's not yet in the position of being enough in front of consumers that other people have come in and said, I could do something really interesting with this. I now see this as a tool that I could use, I could build upon. I still think that they're waiting for that moment for it to go over the edge. Something about, probably not the price point, but more about the technology that it puts in front of you. What you see when you put it on your head. It's still not quite there yet, and it's not accessible for us just to jump into it at the moment. There still is quite a high barrier to entry. If you want to do something useful in it, you're still going to have to develop on the actual hardware itself rather than use the platforms that are given to you by the providers. And they're doing their best, probably a little bit of a victim of trying to make a platform that works for everyone, whereas in reality, it doesn't really do a lot for anyone. We need to find our way with it, and someone will, and there will be different markets and different niches, but someone will. They'll hit the nail on the head. They'll discover a way of doing something. I don't know, a particular interface. There'll be a technology innovation that makes things like haptics come to life. We'll get over the resolution and the color aspect, or the weight of it, or the fact that people get very tired when they've got it on. Some people get motion sickness. All these things, we will get over them, and it needs to come down to a small enough list that people think, what, this is good enough that I can put up with what's not good about it, and move it forward.
Yeah, but I mean, the strong point, which it sounds like we're both making, is that the tipping point will come. It's not really a matter of if; it's just kind of when. It's funny you mentioned the motion sickness thing. I actually wanted to ask you about that. What about the motion sickness thing? Because I've gotten feedback from some people that they've really been turned off by the usage because they get bothered by that. And I haven't really looked into what the finer points of of that are. But yeah, I mean, that's a thing, I gather, or what can you tell me about that?
It's definitely a thing, and some people seem to be susceptible to it. Some people get it almost straight away. Some people, it takes a little bit of time. Me personally, I've only suffered it when with certain configuration of the headset. So when you and I were first investigating the Meta headsets, and we both bought one, I was very keen to use it. Put it on, and it goes through a setup, which and part of that is let's adjust for comfort, Rich. So I'm like, no, turn all these off. I can do all of this. And I put it on super smooth movement. And I was walking around one of the demonstration applications, and it didn't take me very long to feel quite ill. But I then went back and I followed the recommendations of the headset, funnily enough. But what I did find over time is that as I got more used to wearing a headset, more used to, I guess my brain subconsciously more used to seeing a couple of screens right in front of me, I could reintroduce those things slowly. So it's a new experience. I mean, nobody walks around with their mobile phone strapped directly to their eyes, do they? So that's essentially what these things are. You have to ease yourself into it. And that could be that's something that would need to be considered if we're moving this forward as a training platform. Is this accessible to everyone? Yes, everyone can buy one, or their company can provide one, or training providers can provide them as part of the license costs for the training itself. But is it going to work for everyone? So that needs to be taken into account. And I think there's probably a combination of making sure as content creators that you've considered that, rather than it would be very easy to ignore that if it didn't affect you. But also the hardware manufacturers, I know that they are trying to move beyond that, trying to find out what is the trigger for that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And from a content design standpoint too, and a training content design standpoint, I should say that we don't have to start from scratch here. I mean, it is a new modality, but the issue of accessibility especially in digitally delivered learning content is a long-standing concern, especially if you work with government or federal clients or something like that. So there's lots of guidance there. There's sort of baseline rules that could be, I think, repurposed for some of these types of things. A lot of the considerations around accessibility have been thought about. So there's a lot of expertise from our sort of training delivery background that could be leveraged. Not maybe 100% retread there, but it could maybe get us like 60-70% of the way towards coming up with like accessibility policies and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it really would fall into that. And there would be other things as well. Like, you could try and make your content really engaging. Let's have an activity where that's the beauty of a virtual reality training course. You might make a very straightforward looking training course, but for the activity, you could say, right, we're going to go to a room which is purposely designed for this particular activity. And it could be something quite physical in nature. You could be moving around. So you'd have to remember that not everybody might have the space to move around, or someone might be so immersed that they would start moving around and forget that they didn't have any space. I've definitely walked into the wall with my virtual reality headset, because despite the fact that the graphics aren't really that amazing, they are very, very convincing to your brain. And it's very easy for you to forget that you are confined in the real world, whereas maybe not in the virtual world.
So interesting. Well, Rich, we're coming up on our time here. So this has been a great conversation, which was not a surprise. Never disappoints chatting with you. But I'll give you the last word before we sign off and just see, is there anything else we haven't talked about and related to this topic that you want to say?
I just think that point that I said before, that I was telling people a couple of years ago, you might not believe it, but it's coming. Virtual reality is coming. It's got a relentless push behind it. Meta announced the other day, it was Mark Zuckerberg that announced, I think he just dropped it in, that, oh, by the way, I'm nearly ready to demonstrate my new holographic headset. And people were like, what? Where did that come from? They are putting billions of dollars of research into this. And I know they might have pivoted a little bit towards AI within the last year, but the fact that people like Apple are out there now, this is a future for computing. It is coming, and it's going to be really exciting and a game changer. It will be a shift in, I think, just how we live, just like mobile phones and social media, where I think it has the potential to be highly impactful.
It certainly has the same feel, in terms of just a general technology cycle. So, well, Rich, this has been great. Thanks a lot. We will pester you to try to talk about some other nerdy topic that we both dig quite a bit at some point in the future. So really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. See ya.